have to give permission to be included on that recording. So at any rate, hi, I am Rick Randolph. I am a Senior Chief Medical Officer for Heart to Heart International, and also the chair of the Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group, and a lot of other wonderful environmental organizations here in town. The Sierra Club, of course, the Sustainable Sanctuary Coalition, Presbyterians for Earth Care, Heartland Earth Keepers, and we work with a whole lot of wonderful people. And I'm trying to bring today a kind of a different take on the environment, different effects that can occur when you actually go and cause problems with the environment. So this is really looking for, and let me pull this up right here. This should hopefully pull up. There we are. So yeah, basically on how harming the environment can create the conditions that trigger infectious disease emergence. So as way of background, I am a family physician, and I have a certificate in public health in the developing world. I've spent a lot of time in the developing world, particularly Africa, Haiti, to some extent over in Asia, and I've worked with a lot of the emerging infectious diseases. I worked with the Ebola over in West Africa, cholera in Haiti, Zika, chikungunya viruses, certainly malaria in a lot of different places that I went. And in the United States, I worked with COVID, both in vaccinating treatment as well as testing. And so we're going to explore the connections really between infectious disease and epidemics and the pandemics that we've been experiencing here. One of the things I'd like to show you, and it went out in the kind of initial information on this, is a video. And I'm really, if you did see it, I want you to see it again, just kind of let the experience kind of wash over you. If you've not seen it before, this will be interesting for you. It really kind of adds an emotional knowledge to supplement really what's going to be more of a fact presentation here. So it is, there we go. And it is much more impressive with the sound. I did not apparently click on the allow your sound to come in. It does have subtitles. And this on the next slide is the electron micrograph of the SARS CoV-2 virus. It's really not in color. They say some of them are in color, but they don't really, they're not sure what color means down at that level. So the question though is, what is the difference between the virus that was inside the bat in Wuhan before it crossed over to the US, to the humans, and the first human infection in Wuhan? The answer is there's absolutely no difference. There was no mutation, no evolution, nothing was there that had to happen to facilitate that spillover from an animal reservoir to human DNA. So what we're going to do is next go on, talk a little bit about zoonotic diseases. So zoonotic diseases are, and we have to get a little bit of terminology here down. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that come over from other hosts, other species hosts, which may, and those ones may have little or no problem with being infected. And they cross over into humans. These constitute about 60% of all infectious diseases that we suffer from. Thing to remember is, particularly for viruses, spillover really isn't between species, though. Spillover actually occurs between groups of DNA or traits of DNA. So viruses are not specific for a species. They are specific for a section of DNA. When we have interrelationship between different species, for example, between monkeys and humans, you know, we share a lot of DNA. And if the virus inhabits one part of the DNA of a monkey, and we have a similar part of DNA in us, then that virus can jump from the monkey, which may tolerate the virus very well, over to us where we don't. That is one of the things that happened with Ebola. And so, you know, that's about how it works. Zoonotic disease works in viruses and bacteria and protists. Basically, they are just looking for something with a similar metabolism in which they can grow. Host animals can be multiple. So you can have SARS CoV-2, the host animal can be a bat. Bats are very common for a source of the different infections. That includes COVID, AIDS, Ebola, SARS, West Nile virus, lots and lots of them. Ticks are another transmitter of diseases, particularly for some of the bacteria. You think of Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, by the way, is not a real common disease in people, thankfully. It's a nasty one. Untreated, it has a high mortality rate. Even treated, is still about 1% of people will die from it. And you don't see very much of it. But I was talking with a veterinarian a few years back, and he had several dogs that had picked up Rocky Mountain spotted fever over in Shawnee Mission Park. And in that particular case, the ticks that transmitted the Rocky Mountain spotted fever had just happened to bite the dogs in the dog walk area and not the people who were out there with them. And of course, the mosquitoes are wonderful transmitters of both viruses as well as diseases like malaria, or kind of related to the mosquito leishmaniasis, which is transmitted by a sandfly. Next, we're going to go take a look at just how new diseases have been really increasing over the last half century. This is a little video, and it's just illustration of the rapidity of which new diseases have been popping up. So this was in the mid-40s. No, I think it's more. And you can see Congo, Crimean hemorrhagic fever in 44, 1948, several new species of malaria. In 1960, it accelerated with the Jamestown Canyon fever, quinine-resistant falciparum malaria, HIV, MRSA. 1990s, it was ehrlichiosis, invasive E. coli, several other rickettsial diseases, leishmaniasis, and other protozoan diseases. It just continues to increase and increase and increase. And many of these diseases have the potential for really widespread disease. There are a number of risk factors for spillover. One thing to emphasize is that when a pathogen spills over from one species into humans, it is not the will of God. It is natural, and it is the expected consequence of what we are doing to the environment. Risk factors for it include loss of biodiversity. Basically, we've been modifying the habitats for potential pathogens in humans and allowing them to meet. Other risk factors include the wildlife, the wet markets. This is an issue over in China with COVID. Increased intrusion of humans into what had previously been non-human areas to contact the habitat. This is a picture from a helicopter when I was in Liberia. This is what's called slash and burn agriculture. The people had been driven out of the normal agricultural areas during the civil war they had there, and they had started inhabiting the jungle just for safety purposes, but also they needed something to eat. So they would go basically clear the forest, they would burn it, and then they would farm it for 3 or 4 years until the soil was exhausted, and they would move on and do that again. And when you intrude into the habitat that you're not normally in, then you will just run into a lot of things that can cause problems. Climate change is another risk factor. Climate change basically occurs when you are forcing populations into new areas. So when birds fly further north and remain within what's their kind of temperate comfort zone, they will come in contact with different animals. When the temperature increases and the animals move higher up in the altitude, then they will encounter new creatures that may not have moved or may have run out of room of moving. When areas become wet and you have more increased rain, then you will have other mosquitoes will grow there that can transmit disease in areas which have not been happening before. This leads to host switching. It's not so much transmission of disease between people, but transfer of the bacteria or virus or protozoa from one species to another that is not involving humans. Kind of characteristic to think about it, and it's a term, it's called sloppy fitness space. I know it's kind of a weird term, but basically it means that some of the parasites will be kind of marginal in the host species that they're in. They'll be there, they don't thrive, they don't really harm the host species, but if they encounter a new species that is much, say the new species doesn't have the same kind of immune system or a different metabolic system than its current host, then it can jump over, it can find new DNA, new metabolism that is much more hospitable to it. And then it can grow and grow and grow. And then because of the concentration of the new infecting agent there, it can be transmitted to others. But the important thing to realize is that there is no mutation needed or new capability needed for an infection to jump from one species to another. And then once the pathogens have expanded to new hosts, of course, you can also develop novel variants, which is what we're experiencing now with COVID. And the global interconnectedness that comes with our wonderful transportation system can make the disease spread worldwide. Picture COVID, Ebola, and you name it. Another risk factor for spillover is the lack of biodiversity. And this isn't something that just applies to people. For example, potatoes. Potatoes came over from the New World during the Columbian Exchange, and they did very well and provided a wonderful source of calories in Ireland and in Scotland. Also, though, came over the potato blight, which also originated in the New World and came over to Ireland, Scotland, and everywhere else. In Ireland and Scotland, the potato blight just wiped out all the potatoes, and that caused a huge calamity, costing probably 1 million deaths in the Celtic areas. But it never caused any problem or nothing similar over in the New World, where it had been for millennia. And why is that? Because the potatoes there were not clustered into huge areas. You did not have monoculture there. So when a potato would become infected with a potato blight, it had a very difficult time transmitting itself to a new potato plant because the new potato plants were further afield. And so there was a dilution effect that really protected from pandemics such as occurred in Ireland and Scotland. Deforestation certainly is another one that changes the feeding patterns. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with Nipah virus. And habitat diversity also helps prevent the overgrowth of one or several species that can transmit disease. And we'll look at that with Lyme disease. Other risk factors include wet markets. Wet markets really, those are the wildlife markets. It's really their game markets, is what we would call them here, that occur and that really trigger really an unnatural contact between species. Everything's jammed together. Often they're malnourished and stressed with being in captivity, and that increases the risk for infection and makes it easier to transmit infections between two different species. And harvesting the animal, slaughtering them also exposes others to potential infectious sources there. And, you know, it may be really kind of innocent. Back in, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, I was in Nairobi and I said, yeah, you know, this would be fun. I could go, there's a touristy kind of place called Carnivore. And you go there and it's a restaurant and they serve you all these different meats from different species. You get crocodile and you get water buffalo and ostrich and snakes and all sorts of different animals. Well, those came from a market where most often they are kind of jumbled together. And that's the, you know, that places a risk for disease transmission, host switching between different species there, and then possible extension into humans. I'd like to digress a little bit about hosts and amplifier hosts. For the original SARS, and probably for SARS CoV-2 that we have currently, the host animal is the bat. And what they will do is the bats don't actually actively infect that many people. Bats just aren't very good at it. They don't have that much direct contact with us. But they have contact with animals that have contact with us. And so what happened was with the particularly SARS and probably SARS CoV-2 is the bats infected the civets. Civets, a small little rodent kind of animal, often used for food. And then the civets infected people. Then people infected people. And that's how SARS and COVID went around. Similar systems with bats and pigs with Nipah virus. And then there was another virus over in Australia called Hendra virus, again, highly lethal, that went between bats and horses. The bats have been around a long time. They've been around for 20 million, 30 million years. And they're very complex, very diverse group. If you just count up the number of mammalian species that are here now, almost 20% are bats. And the bats had been really stable with their internal environment. One of the funny things is that we have lots of viruses in us. We have lots of bacteria. We have lots of fungus and protists and everything that's kind of growing inside it. In fact, we actually do better with a lot of that, but they don't cause problems. And that's sort of the same thing that was happening with the bats. They would live with these viruses and then they would cause no problem. It's only when the bats jumped over to others and when we came in contact with viruses that we had no immune experience to, that really we ran into problems. Other risks for spillover, increased intrusion of humans in a non-human environment, and it kind of went in there. That happens not only in things like slash and burn agriculture, but basically there's just a lot more humans than there were before, and we keep increasing at a relatively fast amount. All these extra humans mean increased intrusion into non-human inhabited areas through the need for food and for economic purposes. Now I'd like to get a little bit into some of the viruses themselves. SARS is the original coronavirus that came through and caused problems. Coronavirus is a family of viruses, and a lot of them were, I don't know, they cause colds. So not a real big deal. SARS was the first one, coronavirus, that made the jump over that was really causing a problem. It came from bats, probably the horseshoe bat over in China, actually fairly definitively from the horseshoe bat over in China, and through the civets and became an infected people, probably through a wet market someplace in central China. It is a respiratory virus, and the virus is called SARS-associated coronavirus, or the original SARS CoV. It is primarily respiratory and seems to be more focused there than the multi-system effects of the COVID-19 that we have right now. It jumped over in 2002 and actually was eliminated, or at least not eliminated, but it was eliminated in humans by 2004. But it was a nasty virus. 11% of the people that contracted it died. And it had a nasty pattern of late contagion. So people would get it, they would get sick, but they wouldn't really be in the point of passing things on for a while. And when they really became contagious was when they were in the hospitals, and they became incredibly contagious. Well, that was a problem for the healthcare workers. So the health system, particularly in China and other areas where it spread, was really hit hard by the SARS. The one advantage, though, if you can say it, was that it really was a late, it had a late contagion rather than early contagion. That is its big difference from the SARS CoV-2 virus that causes COVID, which will start infecting people very early or even before they develop symptoms. Oh yeah, there's your SARS CoV-2. And you can see sort of the family resemblance between the original SARS and the SARS CoV-2. Another disease that is a emerging infectious disease that spilled over is Lyme disease. Now, Lyme disease is a bacteria. Most people have probably heard about it. Typical symptoms include fever, headache, fatigue, skin rash called erythema cutaneous migrans. And if untreated, it can really cause some problems, spreading to the joint, heart, and the nervous system. But it's kind of quirky because people and the bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi, have been present in the same areas for 15 to 20,000 years. And it was not until the 1970s really that it emerged as a problem. So what's going on here? Well, this is where we have to look at the role of the hosts. The primary host for the bacteria that causes Lyme disease is the white-footed mouse, and then secondarily the deer tick. Well, the white-footed mouse is really a non-fastidious animal. It will grow anywhere and reproduce like crazy. It does not require a lot of space. It is fairly easily transplanted from one place to another, and it's typically kept in check by its competitors and its predators. So what happened in the 1970s in the the New England area in the Northeast that caused it to take off? Well, what happened was a big change in the forestry patterns in the Northeast. So what had been large, contiguous, uninterrupted stretches of forest became broken up into smaller and smaller amounts. So if you had a forest and it was chopped up into, I don't know, a dozen pocket parks, the white-footed mouse didn't mind that at all. It would just keep doing just fine. But the foxes, the bobcats, great horned owls, and weasels really required larger contiguous habitat for them to flourish. And these are the ones that would go eat up all the white-footed mice and keep their population under control. So when the predators went away, then the mice went to play and reproduced. And sort of a secondary characteristic of the white-footed mouse is that they don't mind having ticks on them. Possums and squirrels remove more than 90% of their ticks. White-footed mouse will remove less than 50%. That means there's a lot of ticks that are sitting there basically gorging on the white-footed mouse that once they have their full blood meal, they'll drop off and wait for whatever time that they wait until it's time to go looking for another blood meal. Well, they are infected with the Borrelia burgdorferi bacteria. So when they go looking for a new blood meal and they find a person, they will bite and then they will transmit the disease to them. So really, with the increased number of the white-footed mice, the ticks will be transmitting a lot more of the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And that's what we've seen. And it continues to expand. It's expanded all the way across the US. And sort of, oops, I'm sorry, there's the white-footed mouse. And this shows how it's spread across the US. And it's spread over to Europe. And with a little bit of host transfer, it's now mainly hosted by the European red squirrel. But it's a big problem in France and up into the UK and over in Germany. West Nile virus, another one that's out there. This one causes encephalitis. It's mosquito transmitted. About 1 in 5 people who get it will develop a fever and other symptoms. About 1 in 150 will develop a serious, sometimes fatal illness. Other symptoms typically are going to be headache, body ache, joint ache, vomiting, diarrhea, rash, neurological problems. Majority of people with the West Nile virus will recover completely, but fatigue and weakness can persist for weeks or months, and some of the neurologic symptoms can be permanent. Having gone through medical school in the 80s, it was just not mentioned. It wasn't there. But something happened in the 1990s, and this is probably a case where there was some mutation that allowed it to start becoming transmitted from the to humans much easier. And so it started expanding. The range started expanding. They had initially outbreaks in the birds and the humans in the Middle East. By the way, West Nile doesn't refer to West Nile, New York. It is the West Nile area in Egypt. And the outbreak spread, and then they spread across Europe and then into North America. And now they're following the bird flyways and going through. So this is an area where it's another disease that can be caused by mosquitoes that really you have to be careful with your making sure that if you're going to be outside that you're wearing mosquito repellent. Nipah virus is another one that's really interesting. In 1998, a number of pig farmers died and when they contracted this disease, really highly lethal, about 50% mortality. And so the Malaysian government really, with the help of the CDC, went out to investigate what is going on here. Background to that was that the urban populations in Malaysia had doubled over 50 years, and the agricultural production had increased 8-fold over the last 30 years. How was that happening? Well, basically palm oil. So they began clearing forests in the 1980s and 90s. And the animals that inhabited, including fruit bats, had to go look for new areas of food. And this was further worsened by the smoke from the clearance fires that really impaired the yields on the fruit trees that were in the jungle. So really, you had a bunch of hungry bats going around looking for things. So what did they find? They ventured beyond the forest and they found that the Malaysian farmers had fruit trees. Well, they were being very economical, and they had pigs. And when they had the pigs, they put them in sties, and then they would use the droppings from the pigs and the sties to fertilize the fruit trees and get better yields. So all those juicy looking fruits would attract the bats. The bats would go over there and roost in the trees and start eating the fruit. These fruit bats were not particularly fastidious. They would drop the fruit after a couple of bites, and they would sit there, and then feces and urine would drop down into the pigsty and infect the pigs. Well, the pigs could transmit this disease to humans fairly well, just with respiratory secretions and when the pigs were harvested. So this ended up causing a real big problem, particularly for the local farmers. Eventually, they were able to identify the virus, and they were able to put the connection together to be able to control this. But it still crops up in Indonesia, and although it's not really cropped up in Malaysia since then. And that is, yeah, there's your pigs for the Nipah virus. Rabies is another disease that crosses over from animals to humans. We might think of rabies as being pretty rare, but actually throughout the world, and particularly in the developing world, it is not a rare disease. About 60,000 deaths a year are attributed to rabies, which are spread. It's one of the ones that is 60,000 deaths without any person-to-person spread. So they come from the bats, they go to either skunks, raccoons, dogs, other animals, who then transmit it on to people. I was in Haiti back in the mid-90s, and I had a veterinarian that was off seeing, just taking care of things and kind of scouting things out in one of the villages, when all of a sudden he heard a dog yelling and crying, squealing, and he went over there, and there were a bunch of people had gathered around this dog and had beaten it to death with long sticks. And so he goes, what's going on here? And go, well, this is what we do when a dog starts fighting people. Okay. So he goes, yeah, this could be rabies. So he gathered the dog with the village's permission, gathered the dog, took it back to our place, and we tried to get it tested over at the Port-au-Prince hospital, main hospital. Well, that didn't happen. They didn't have the technology. So we said, well, what can we do? And we went and said, okay, we got an airplane going back to Fort Bragg later that day. Well, we'd given the seat away to a lawyer, but we said, okay, you have to transport this thing back. So we packed it, we took the head off, packed it in dry ice, and taped it all up and sent it back with this lawyer in his lap. The funny thing about Haiti at that time, it was still, we had to clear customs, so the lawyer declared a diseased dog brain on this package, and customs decided not to open the box. But when we got it back to Fort Bragg, our people took it over to the local public health office. They took it out, tested it for rabies, and it just lit up like crazy. So we went back to the village, and we administered a whole bunch of rabies immune globulin and started vaccination series, and thankfully nobody ever developed symptoms. But that's, rabies is out there. Ebola, again, we're running the same sort of thing from bats, and in this case also monkeys are probably natural reservoirs as well, going over to human. Probably the first person that actually in the West, Ebola popped up multiple times before in Uganda, Congo, and both Congos, and it always would burn itself out. Basically, it would spread within a small village, and most of the people in the village would die, and then it would not go beyond there. There just wasn't enough transportation in there for that. In West Africa, and probably in 2013, there was a 2-year-old girl in the country of Guinea that somehow or other was exposed to fluids from either a monkey or a bat, and probably became the first person infected with Ebola in the West African epidemic that really raged from 2014 to 2015. Why did the girl get it? Well, a lot of it was on the intrusion of humans into native areas, or non-human native areas, with land cultivation, wild game hunting. And then once the disease occurred in the girl, it was the transportation, which really increased the reach and death toll of Ebola during that epidemic. And so we had Ebola certainly in the main three countries of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, but we also had Ebola made its way to Mali, to Senegal, to Nigeria, in small amounts, and eventually to the US. So that was a big issue there. So what can we do? USAID, or U.S. Agency for International Development, has an emerging infectious disease program. And what they do is they work together with regional, national, and local organizations to build capacity for early disease detection, diagnosis, rapid response, and risk reduction. So one of the 4 parts of their program is PREDICT. And so what they do with this is they identify emerging pathogens that could become a threat. They work in hotspots, so particularly in Africa and Asia, and they will basically concentrate on bats, rodents, and non-human primates, among other things, doing surveys of the animals' potential sources, looking for the viruses there. And they would build predictive maps for potential outbreaks. They have a RESPOND program where they network public health schools, veterinary schools, medical schools in Africa and Southeast Asia, really to try and get the other specialties to understand what the emerging infectious disease can do, because it can show up as a veterinary problem, it can show up as a healthcare problem, or it can be noticed through public health issue methods to be able to say, yeah, there's a problem here. So you have to really educate all 3 specialties to be able to get the quickest recognition. They also try to develop a response algorithm when there's a suspected outbreak, and they will also support if an outbreak, if it's required. Okay, and that's a picture right there from their website. The Identify structure focuses on strengthening laboratory capacity to diagnose and report the common human and animal pathogens, really working mostly with the laboratory assessment tools. And Prevent focuses on trying to evaluate the risks that are associated with disease transmission between animals and people, and to develop strategies to try and prevent that. Some of the programs under that umbrella include EcoHealth, where they scan luggage at airports for imported wildlife. They also, it's much more granular. They'll go out and help instruct people in the developing world on how to butcher bushmeat safely. And they help instruct on how to build feedlots in high-risk habitats, which is really what happened in Malaysia. Malaysia eliminated Nipah because the government went in and worked with the farmers to remove the styes away from the fruit trees. And once they did that, they had no further recurrence of the Nipah virus. So what can we do? Well, a number of different things that we can do individually and corporately as a country and as a community. It's really reducing the greenhouse gases to reduce climate change. That is one of the big things that's driving contacts from animals to humans. Reducing consumption, particularly that which drives people into novel habitats. And this is where you think of cell phones. There's all the rare earth elements that are in the cell phones, and well, those come from places where there aren't normally people, which are the eastern Congo, for example. So you push miners into that area, they become, they will often hunt for food, and they will become exposed to animals that normally they wouldn't. Well, that is one of the contributing factors to the 2 last outbreaks, which are major outbreaks of Ebola in East Congo. Other things we can do are reduce the habitat disruption and to work on improving our habitat diversity. This is really in line with the Biden administration 30 by 30 plan to be able to create nature protected areas where where diversity can flourish. This doesn't help. There is still an issue with reduced diversity in other areas, but at least this will be protecting the diversity in that 30% of the U.S. land and sea area. And one of the other ones that we can do is really improve socioeconomic status of the least of these. One parasite that I didn't talk about a lot is malaria. Malaria was one of the Columbian exchange diseases. It came over from Southern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa and spread across the entire continent of North America. It was one of the diseases that really created that really was very hard on, actually killed quite a few of the Native Americans. And it really followed the settlers as we came across the country. It was so widespread. It traveled from the East Coast, across the Great Plains, up into southern Canada, and all the way over to the West Coast, and was a huge scourge. But it was slowly eliminated in the US by various public health measures, but never went away until the 1940s. There was a very persistent, for 40 or 50 years, presence of malaria in the Mississippi Delta among the blacks there. And that was finally resolved in the 40s after the great migration of the blacks from the South to the North caused the plantation owners and employers in the South to have to pay people more, have to pay blacks more to keep them there. And when the blacks had more income and better living conditions, they were able to actually have houses that they could put screening up, prevent the mosquitoes from coming in the house. Before the lodgings just were not even sufficient enough to be able to keep out mosquitoes. So I guess final points, things to remember, is that we, through our consumer habits, have changed the planet so that we dominate every ecosystem on the Earth. And the ecosystem is fragile. And climate change will continue to place it under stress. And emerging infectious diseases are here to stay. Our goal is not to prevent disease emergence, that comes from the contacts, but really to cushion the blow. And lastly, don't blame other countries. Don't blame nature. It's really our fault. So thank you. And I am available for questions. Let's see, I can't even have, I'm gonna have to go, I'm gonna stop the screen sharing so I can see if there's anything in the chat. And yeah, okay. Diane, I see you have a question.
Yeah, what's the latest on malaria prevention?
Boy, I'm not hearing a thing.
Okay, I'll
I don't know if that's okay. What's the latest on malaria prevention? Thank you. You put it in the chat for me. Yeah, malaria is a constantly evolving parasite. It's continually trying to evade our medicines. So there's a lot of resistance malaria, but there's actually some hope that's coming out from the vaccine that is a lot of good experimental data on that. So we're waiting on further evaluation of the data. That's really a pretty new thing. But one of the things we have to be careful about, similar to vaccines for COVID and a lot of other stuff, it is possible for the mosquitoes to, the malaria to develop resistance even or evasion methods for the vaccine. So it's going to be kind of a constant battle with it. And if a person could, this is from Jeannie and Gary, if a person got a mild case of COVID early on, should they get the vaccine? Well, I'm not sure if this is actually a question on emerging infectious disease, and this one certainly fits. So yes, you should. One of the things that they found is that you are much more likely to get recurrent COVID if you have had the disease but not been vaccinated. That is particularly true if you got infected early on and were not exposed to variants such as the Bravo or the Delta variant, because those ones seem to be better at going back and infecting people that have already been infected. Then question from Jim Turner. If phones are widespread, is it getting more feasible to get treatments out to where the breakouts occur? I think you're talking about Ebola in that case, and yeah, we have evolved a ton in terms of how we treated Ebola. That is before we made a lot of fixed sites up in West Africa, and what you had to do is predict where the disease was going to go because it took so long to set them up and or move them. So it's much more mobile now. There are strike forces, and we have the wonderful tool at our disposal right now, which is the Ebola vaccine. And so we can go and, both for medical providers as well as people who've been in close contact with it, we can vaccinate them. That, of course, depends on making sure that, depends on people being willing to accept the vaccine. Vaccine hesitancy is a problem in other countries as well as right here, particularly when you have a disease as fearsome as Ebola is. Next is from Helen's iPhone, and how is that vaccinated persons are getting COVID-19 and its variants and dying? I know vaccinated people who have died from COVID-19. Right now, there are no absolute guarantees on anything, but I am not aware of anybody that is in an that has a functioning immune system that has been vaccinated and that has died of COVID. There have been people who've gotten sick, but if they have died from it, it's a very, very small percentage. Certainly, the vaccine is very helpful. And most people that get COVID after having been vaccinated, most of them don't even know that they had it. And you wouldn't really know that they had COVID except for testing for it. So really, so much of this stuff you're working on, kind of playing the odds. There will be people who never got vaccinated, who never get the disease, but the odds of the odds are that you are much more likely to get the disease and to have a bad outcome if you have not been vaccinated than if you have been vaccinated. Let's see here. And any other questions? Okay, yeah, got some more. From Jim. It says, yes, we should cut consumption. Seems unlikely that rare earths won't be sought. Must mining companies more proactively communicate warnings to miners? Other proactivity that can avoid pandemics. East Congo is a funny place. Congo is a huge country. Congo is the same size as the United States east of the Mississippi. And the communications network over there probably isn't a whole lot better than a lot of the areas of the east of the Mississippi at the time we acquired them. Most of the communication east to west in Congo still goes along the Congo River. Eastern Congo is essentially ruled by gangs. warlords. So they have their own priorities, the main one of which is money. And trying to, and the mining is also done by the gang, so, or the warlords. So it's a system that could be controlled if Rwanda, which is the recipient of most, or the transit area for most of the rare earths, was actually willing to rein that in, but they are not willing to rein it in because it means a lot of money. And from Helen, are smokers at greater risk for COVID? Probably at greater risk to acquire it. Anybody, to acquire any disease, you have to get a certain amount of the infectious agent, be it virus, bacteria, whatever. You can, your body will take care of small amounts of any infectious agent. That's what your immune system's there for. So smokers have a harder time clearing the mucus in their lungs, and the either bacteria or the viruses can accumulate in that mucus, and either, if in the bacteria's case, they can multiply in the mucus. In the virus case, they gives them just longer contacts between stuff that's inhaled and contact with the bloodstream, so it's easier to become infected. So really, the smokers are at greater risk for COVID, both for catching it and for consequences. That's just another good reason to stop smoking.
Does Diane have a question? I notice her hand is appearing.
Okay.
Diane, you have a question?
Oh,
And
it was from before.
no, it's funny.
I just need to.
Okay.
You guys are obviously hearing me. I'm not hearing much feedback right now through these. I'm going to go try and take these off in case there are other questions to come up. There's just something a little bit weird that I'm not picking things up.
You're saying you're not hearing people's voices. Can you hear mine?
I can get it now. For whatever reason, I wasn't hearing the others coming through my earbuds. Although the microphone was there, so obviously you were picking me up.
Yeah.
Okay, so without those in, I can hear what you're saying, Jerry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Is there really any concern that the COVID virus is manufactured in China?
I think the odds of it are low. It's out there. We have to do something with it anyhow. But we've got very good data that a virus that is really near identical, when you look at it, from a genetic point of view, near identical with the original SARS, and we've traced that one very definitively to the bats, through the civets to people. So if I had to bet the mortgage on something, I would bet that it was a natural one to go through there. If it was a biological weapon, it's really not a particularly efficient one. You'd think that they would use something, that they'd be experimenting with something like Nipah virus, which is also already out there and already developed, but has a 50% mortality if you wanted a weapon. So I don't have a good explanation for why they would want to have a military laboratory working on it. I suppose they could be doing some basic research on it and then had an accident, and that's, I guess that's possible. But by far, to me, the most likely thing is it's going to follow the exact same pathway that the original SARS CoV went, which was bats to civets to human.
What is the likelihood we might see another pandemic simultaneously with COVID that's a completely different source?
The odds are actually increasing over time. It's really is just it's contact. It is the number of times you have interspecies contacts, because when you we all species and harbor a lot of different things that aren't good for other species. If you, for example, with the humans, if you look at a human and you count every single unit, every single cell, every single human cell is a unit of DNA. Every bacteria is a unit of DNA. Each virus is a unit of DNA. Each fungus, each protozoan inside your skin as a unit of DNA. When you look at somebody, when you look at me, I am 10% human. You have that much other material that's floating around inside you. You are probably more a collective noun than you are a singular noun. And so it's when all these different things can kind of jump around, particularly the viruses can jump around if they find something with a similar DNA trait. So when we're talking about, like variants developing and that sort of thing, what we're talking about is really a virus out there that is selecting a different trait. They trade little chunks of genes between different viruses. So they trade little bits of DNA or RNA for COVID, between different viruses, and then sometimes that works better than the other one, and then you'll get growth like you do of the Delta variant. But there's enough other stuff that spills over all the time that frankly you don't have to work real hard to get something else come out new. It's happening all the time.
Well, I don't want to chase you away. By the way, I'm Jerry Reese. For some of you that came on late, I'm a member of the Environmental Action Committee of Village Church. Rick said he may have to bail out here any minute now, any second. Is there any last comment you want to say? Do you want to continue recording? And maybe when we all leave, the recording will stop. How do you want to handle the recording?
Yeah, why don't you just let me stop it right now? I don't want it to go flying off into the ether. And I will say that this was actually something I've wanted to do for a long time. It's sometimes you clarify your own thoughts when you have to put them down on paper or on electronically, and I've wanted to be able to give this talk for a while. So I am happy for the opportunity to be able to do it, and I hopefully was able to kind of provide a little extra information for people.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, excellent. Woo.
What I might do is grab the meeting away from Rick so he can leave, and I thought I might. This event was co-sponsored by Earthkeepers of Heartland Presbytery, Environmental Action Committee of Village Church,